Hi, I'm Debbie Georgatos. Welcome to my show, America, Can We Talk? Today, we're going to talk about millennials are less patriotic and more socialist in a new poll. Carrie Severino joins me to talk about the Supreme Court decision on Title VII and the LGBT decision. And finally, when the military betrays the president. And I'll tell you why these stories matter to you. Stay tuned.
Debbie Georgatos, host of America Can We Talk, is an author, attorney, and political analyst whose mission is to inspire the American political conversation about preserving liberty in the best country on earth.
Hello again and welcome to America Can We Talk and to today's First Five. In the course of the astonishing riots and violence we have seen over the last couple of weeks, there was one image I want to talk about today in the First Five. And I sent this image to Matt, the wonderful producer, and it is of people, the rioters in this country, in Philadelphia, tearing down a statue. And this, okay, there it is right there. This is a statue of Matthias Baldwin. It was in Philadelphia, and they actually didn't tear it down, but you can see the red, they spray painted it, and this one particular rioter is pretending she's jump roping with him. Is mocking the whole statue. And you can see, even from the tweet that you're looking at, it says, rioters in Philadelphia defaced the statue. An early abolitionist who fought against slavery 30 years before it ended. And I want to talk about in the First Five today that there's so much about America and the great and the uniqueness of America, the greatness of America, that young people don't understand, that people who've left high school and college in the recent decade or 2 decades, and in a very bizarre way, it's kind of not their fault. We have not in our country continued to teach the unique greatness of America to the next generation. So young people protesting, and to be really clear, as I've been saying over and over and over, what we saw around the country, the rioting, the arson, the looting, the murders, the just incredible attack, pandemonium in American cities, was not exclusively a reaction to what occurred in Minneapolis. It was, in fact, as becoming more and more obvious, organizations in America, long funded by the radical left, Antifa and Black Lives Matter, some segment of Black Lives Matter, funded by leftists, who have been just waiting for the next triggering event. So, but the point of my First Five today is this. It is despicable that we had, as we talked with our show on the show last week, Alan West talked about in Boston, how some of the rioters actually desecrated a statue dedicated to the first African Americans in this country who wore the American military uniform, escaped slaves who came to the North and joined the Northern Army to fight during the Civil War. That statue was just desecrated and I think destroyed in Boston. This statue we just looked at in Philadelphia. And it's not really, I'm not just lamenting the poor behavior and the destructive violence of the rioters. I'm pointing out the idea that mostly they are so ill-informed that they actually think that America has just a horrific history of racism, that America is a really bad country, that pretty much what they've learned about American history, they don't actually know of any basis. They haven't been taught in their schooling, and I'm not talking about just the radical left and college campuses. I'm talking about the schooling starting at very young ages, through high school, into college, through over the last several decades. We have permitted the content of American education to change, and kind of while we were sleeping, change, so that young people today don't actually have a rooting, a basis in understanding America's greatness that would allow them to react to something like the protests over what happened in Minneapolis, or the demand for changes and policing regulation. They don't have any context about America. They can't figure out whether or not they should be mocking and desecrating and spraying red spray paint on the statue of a man who actually, even before it happened, 30 years ahead of the Civil War, spoke up as an abolitionist. And the final kind of thing I'll cut away with today in this First Five, I talked about there was a poll out, it was a Gallup poll, actually just came out yesterday, that was talking about how young people see America. You had, in this poll, fewer than 20% of millennials, so they're calling millennials 18 to 29 years old, fewer or smaller than 20%, less than 20% of millennials say that they're extremely proud to be an American. Lowest they've ever polled in a long time, and the polling continues. It talks with other age groups too, but I really want to kind of wrap up the first 5 and make the point about this. We have a job. Patriots, Americans, people who know the unique greatness of America, people who understand what America is to the world, what it represents to the world, the country rooted in liberty, rooted in the idea of the Declaration of Independence and the idea of the Constitution that actually was the building block or structure to protect the rights recited in the Declaration of Independence and the rights that are laid out in our Bill of Rights. It is our job not only to teach the next generation and to correct what has happened in our education system so we don't have so many young people who simply have no idea of American history, no idea of the unique greatness of America, and no concept that they've got a role someday in protecting that too. We have to do all of that, but it's not just the young people. It really is within America. I think part of what the election of Donald Trump did was wake a lot of Americans up to thinking through again what this country is. What is the identity of America? It's what my show is dedicated to. My show, America Can We Talk, is always and forever about talking about the unique, extraordinary greatness of America. Not saying America is perfect, not saying our history is perfect, not saying our present system, not saying our policing is perfect, but the idea of America, an idea of America rooted in the rights described, the concept of the rights of man described in the Declaration of Independence, the idea we have rights from God. I always insert my words, simply because you were born, all of us created equal, have rights from God, the right life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and we have a constitution that sets a structure up that is supposed to prevent tyranny from developing. That America is one that too few people understand. Our job, not just to correct the educational system and help young people, it is to help people in every generation of this country, every age, every ethnicity, race, national origin, to understand the unique, extraordinary greatness of America, because that is indeed what is under siege in this country. And that, my very fine friends, is today's First Five. As I mentioned, we have a guest joining us. I think she's joining us by phone, and she has joined us in the past. Her name is Carrie Severino. And when she joined us before, previously in the show, she was talking about, she is a co-author of a best-selling book called Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Court. She wrote that book along with Molly Hemingway. We had a great interview, very deeply thoughtful interview about the process of our selection of Supreme Court justices, what happened during the Kavanaugh process. But today, Carrie Severino is joining us to talk about a decision by the United States Supreme Court. The name of the decision is Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia. It's actually it was a Supreme Court decision issued having blended together 3 different cases in order for the court to answer the question whether or not the Title VII law, the federal anti-discrimination law, was intended to extend to protection for the LGBTQ community, the claims they may make under federal law. So it's a far-reaching and kind of unexpected and a decision. And Carrie Severino, very briefly to introduce her, she is the Chief Counsel and Policy Director of the Judicial Crisis Network, and she's an expert on the confirmation process. She's been quoted extensively in the media, regularly appears on television, MSNBC, Fox, CNN. Okay, she even goes on CNN, it's kind of amazing. C-SPAN and other places. And today what we're going to talk about is what was the Supreme Court decision in this Title VII case and what the implications are. So, Carrie Severino, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Carrie, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate that so much. And so I just gave a little bit of a lead-in, but the idea of this Supreme Court decision, which was a 6-3 decision, which is, we have a lot of 5-4s, a 6-3 decision. Can you just summarize before we dive into it, kind of the basic idea of what the Supreme Court decided in this case, Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia?
Yeah, and you started to talk about that had to do with the 1964 law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the challenge in this is, there's a lot of people who are talking about this in terms of, well, do we like the idea of having a federal anti-discrimination law that also covers sexual orientation or transgenderism? That's not really the question here. That's some of the implications of the decision. But the question is really, is that type of discrimination already covered by this 1964 law. And the text of the law, I think, makes it pretty clear, because the text of the law, and you often hear this, we're not going to discriminate on the basis of race, national origin, religion, sex. Those are the terms that are in there. It does not list sexual orientation. It does not list gender identity. There are federal laws and there are state laws that do list those things. But it's important that the law that the court was interpreting in the case that came down on Monday, that didn't have that language in it. So the question is, can the language, discrimination because of sex, be read so broadly that it actually incorporates all those things in it? And I think the decision was incorrect, because the understanding of this language has always, from the time it was passed by the legislators who passed it, they did not think it included sexual orientation. They, in fact, discussed whether they should separately include sexual orientation and decided not to. So they thought we're purposely only including discrimination based on sex. We don't want women discriminated against because they're women, or men because they're men. That was the language they used. What has happened here is the court said, well, yeah, but if you look at the word technically, because sexual orientation and transgenderism both have to do with sex, they're incorporated into that discrimination based on sex as well. Unfortunately, that is not how we actually read the laws. We have to read the law the way that it was understood at the time it was passed, and we know that no one at the time understood it that way. For 50 years after the law was passed, every court that looked at this law and when it was challenged on does it include sexual orientation, said no, of course not. It does not do so. So this is a real sea change in the law, and this is the court. We are concerned about judicial activism when the court tries to update the terms of the law. They don't want to say they're doing that. They want to say we're reading this into it, what was always there. But Justice Scalia was very clear about the idea that there isn't a secret hidden meaning to laws that you're going to later discover. We need to make sure that our laws are as our legislators intended. Because if there's a secret hidden meaning there, then when we're passing our laws and when our legislators are voting on them, how do they even know what the law means? That they're passing. We need to make sure we have a system where we can hold our representatives accountable, that we know what the laws really mean going forward. There's obviously opportunities to change those, to update them, to fix things we think might be wrong. There are lots of bills that have been proposed, and there's one that's being discussed in Congress right now that would actually have changed that civil rights law and would have added sexual orientation and gender identity to that. So there's ways to do it, but it's never the judges that change the law. It always has to be our legislators.
Right, and I want to jump in and say one of the points you made early on, and I wanted to say this in beginning this discussion, but it's a really vital point for everyone thinking about this case to understand. The question before the Supreme Court was not, do you think employers should be allowed or that they should terminate people based on sexual orientation, based on their gender identity, based on their gender presentation, based on their transgender status. The question before the court was not, do you think employers should do this? Is this right or wrong? The question was, I'm so glad this is the starting point of what I want to dive into, the job of the court, of every level court, and certainly the Supreme Court, is to look at the law as written, and as you've described, Title VII, huge law when passed, hugely consequential law, controversial law when passed in 1964, did not address sexual orientation or gender identity, which wasn't a big issue at that time, but did not address transgender gender identity. It listed the categories of discrimination you mentioned: race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So it's troubling because many of the headlines I saw today, even in relatively informed places on the internet, would have had headlines like Supreme Court, agrees discrimination against gay Americans should not be legal, or something like that. And it's very troubling because I think a lot of people would read the headline, well, yeah, I don't think people should discriminate, but that wasn't the question. It's not the reason conservatives are bothered by this case. Conservatives are bothered because the court really went off track from trying to understand what the legislature meant and what the law said, and even the legislative history, as you alluded to, and just said, well, it's close enough, we're going to cover it. And so I guess I want to ask, if you want to add anything to that, my little summary there, and then also, so what is the consequence? Is this kind of one-off, not a great decision, but we'll live with it, or are there potential consequences flowing from this decision that could be troublesome?
Yeah. So the consequences also, I mean, there's multiple reasons why it's a problem that the court is doing this and not the legislature. First of all, just because that's how our Constitution set things up. It doesn't say, and then when 5 justices of the Supreme Court vote, your laws change. It says when the Congress, both houses of Congress have to pass a law, it has to be signed by the president. That is how we change our laws, right? So we can't have judges doing this. But Justice Alito, in his dissent to the opinion, also pointed out some other challenges that come up when you have courts doing this thing. If you had it passed through the legislature, then there is a debate, there is room for compromise, there is room to bring up some of the countervailing issues that are going to have to be dealt with. For example, religious freedom. That's something that states that have passed these laws have almost always included issues of, okay, how will we make sure that we can have this while protecting the right of religious organizations or religious individuals to make sure that they are able to run, for example, their church or their synagogue or their religious school consistent with what they're teaching. So that can happen with the legislature. The court didn't really address that. They just said, well, we'll figure out some of these issues as we go. And I think there's hopefully, we will see later courts say, oh, yes, the First Amendment pushes back on this. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act means that you can't force, for example, a Christian school to have teachers who are living a lifestyle that is contrary to what they're teaching. You can't necessarily force a business owner, like in Hobby Lobby when they didn't want to be forced to pay for abortifacient contraceptives, and the Supreme Court supported that right. Now, could there be business owners forced to pay for the much more costly gender-changing surgeries that people may undergo? That would also conflict with their religious freedom. So there's a lot of those questions that now the court just kind of opened up a Pandora's box, and we don't know what the answers will be. There's a lot of issues that may not come up strictly in the employment context, which is where this decision came in, but that are going to naturally follow from it in other areas, having to do with things like bathroom and locker room usage. The court really didn't want to touch it because it's a really thorny topic. However, you can't avoid the question of what's going to happen when biological men are being forced to be admitted into women's locker rooms and the safety issues that naturally flow from that. Is there a future for women's sports if women's sporting leagues are forced to admit biological men who are then competing against biological women? It's not an even playing field. The question of whether women's athletics can even survive this decision is a real one. And again, the court doesn't begin to address these. Those are the kind of things that if we had the Congress doing it, the legislative process, you would have to address those publicly and hash them out, and you'd have people being able to call the representatives and say, hey, I want to make sure that you come to a compromise that still protects these important American interests as well. The court doesn't do that. They're not supposed to be responsive to the American people, but they also aren't supposed to be rewriting the laws in the way that a legislature is doing.
Absolutely. I love the way you summarize that. I'm going to go back to this point you're making about the legislative process. Anyone who's either gone to law school, studied anything about the way legislation is passed, or worked in Washington, it's an amazing process for people, actually at the state level also, state legislatures and the federal level. You have your member of Congress, say we're talking about Congress, your member of Congress, that person has constituents, has people who are the same political party as that person and who are the other political party with it. They're all their constituents. They all have an opportunity to weigh in. They say, have you thought about this issue? What do you think is going to happen this? So you have all the potential ramifications addressed in the legislative process. You have hearings, you have witnesses come. It is a whole process very consistent with the idea of we the people actually being the basic power holders of America, because we the people elect legislators who then pass law, and as the laws they pass are being considered, we have say in it. So to have which this really is an expansion of the Title VII protected categories. It's a new category added by the Supreme Court without the process that the legislature would have provided. And all those examples you gave, Carrie, the idea just of a private religious school saying, we only, we want people who are teaching children in this private religious school to have, the same values we do with respect to sexuality, to human intimacy. because it's important to us in teaching our children. That is just that the whole process for that and accommodation for that happens in legislation is just gone. So and I'll tell you, to me, it's just it's a concerning signal about what we thought we had was a conservative Supreme Court, not a conservative meaning always vote the way the Republican Party wants, but a conservative court, meaning a court tethered to the Constitution, tethered to, which is the idea of what the court is supposed to be, tethered to the rule of law, the Constitution, reasonable interpretation. So Justice Kavanaugh went ahead, he voted with the minority. He voted against the ruling. But in this case, Justice Gorsuch was among those who sided with the majority. And he made reference to the concept of textualism. And you talked a minute about that. But can you talk more about that, like what that means and what that what the argument is why textualism, he says, should permit him to come out the way he did?
Yeah, so textualism is the philosophy of interpreting the laws according to what's written, right? So it seems like it should be obvious, but strangely enough, there are judges who argue that, well, the words of the text can kind of change in their meaning, and what the law meant this year might be different than what it meant last year. Gorsuch is not one of those justices. He does ascribe to textualism and reading the law according to its text, and that's what the minority in the court also agreed. However, I think Gorsuch got it just very wrong in this case. And Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, he wrote a dissent as well as Justice Alito. Justice Kavanaugh's dissent does a great job of explaining how he got wrong. He contrasts a original meaning understanding of textualism, so looking at what the words meant at the time they were passed, as opposed to a literalist version, which is what Gorsuch seems to have done. So Gorsuch kind of took this discrimination because of sex and didn't say, well, what do those words mean? What did those words mean in 1964, for example? What did these legislators think they were doing when they passed this law? And it's not a matter of psychologizing and getting into their heads. It's a matter of simply looking at how those words were used at the time, right? What he did is he took it apart and he said, well, we look at what the word sex and we say this can have to do with sex. I mean, sexual orientation obviously has to do with sex. Transgenderism obviously has to do with sex. And so he says, well, because there's sex involved, it's because of sex, and that it encompasses all of this. What Kavanaugh pointed out is he says that is taking these words apart, you come up with a different result when it's kind of a robotic, dissecting the phrase rather than understanding it as a phrase. And he gave, I thought, some great examples. He said, for example, what if you said, I'm talking about an American flag. Do you mean a flag that's maybe the flag of the country of Germany, but it was produced in an American factory? Well, in one sense, you could say, well, literally, it's an American flag, right? It says made in the USA on it. But it's not, when we say an American flag, you know what we mean. We mean the stars and stripes. We mean a red, white, and blue flag that stands for the United States of America, right? So you can't just take each word separately, look it up in the dictionary, and put them back together in a reductivist kind of way. He said, what about a three-pointer? If I say, oh, someone got a three-pointer, what does that mean? And it doesn't, he said, when you say that, you don't mean a football field goal. It gets 3 points, right? But that when we're talking about a three-point shot, we're talking about basketball, a shot from outside the arc on the court, right? So you have to look at what people mean when they actually use these words. And he gave examples where within legislation, for example, when the word fruit is used, they say, oh, but if we're regulating fruits, does that include tomatoes? And the court has said, you know what, tomatoes may be a fruit botanically. Maybe if you asked a scientist, he'd say a tomato is a fruit, but we know that in general parlance, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking tomatoes as a vegetable, right? So we can't confine ourselves to a hyper-literalism. When we're looking at these, we have to understand statutes, the way the language is actually used by real human beings. And so I think that's where Gorsuch went wrong. However, for the most part, I think his heart's in the right place. He got it wrong this time, but he isn't trying to say, I need to invent new words, new language here. His method of using textualism really got tangled up in this overly literal interpretation rather than actually understanding the words as they were used at the time.
Carrie, I saw some commentary. Actually, it was the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal made reference to or hinted at the idea that maybe Justice Gorsuch was influenced by this Justice Kagan, Elena Kagan, and this actually was referring to the current composition of the Supreme Court as the Kagan Court. Do you have any reason to think that's the case?
You know, I think that was a really interesting insight because Justice Kagan, I remember her confirmation process, and one of the telling things she said as well, we're all originalists now. When she was, even though she doesn't really ascribe to originalism, which was becoming to be very much more in vogue, led on by Justice Scalia, originalism and textualism, she doesn't actually ascribe to it, but she recognized and kind of was joking during her confirmation hearing that everyone has to at least give lip service to the text of the statute now and the original meaning. She is, however, very savvy at being able to use that and then kind of tweak it to still get to a liberal end. And that is what we saw in this case. Now, I obviously, none of us was in the back room as they were making these, they're having their discussions and making the voting. But I absolutely agree that the use by Justice Kagan and by others on the left of quasi-textualist arguments that appeal to a textualist but actually twist it in a subtle way, like this hyperliteralism. That's a very dangerous development. I think Justice Kagan is someone who is uniquely good at employing that to try to lure away textualist votes from what could have been, a majority.
Yep. Okay. That's so interesting. One last thing is, so here we are. We sit after this decision has come down. And so this is, the law of the land. So the recourse for people, you can have a later Supreme Court decision overrule this and say, now that we look back at it, we made the wrong decision. In this case, that's not all that common. People don't do that. So the only other recourse would be to have Congress decide they still could. At this time, they could say, allow us to redefine what we meant by Title VII. We meant the original categories, but we did not mean, sexual orientation. And that is a remedy that's still possible. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely still possible. It's a little bit telling in terms of how inaccurate the decision was to say, okay, if Congress really did want to say just discrimination based on sex, like male or female, how could they? What language would they even have used to say that? And it normally you would just say, oh well, in that case we'll amend the law to say because of sex, but that's what it already says. So yeah, but they could go in and say, all right, it means because of sex. This is not to be interpreted as including sexual orientation, including gender identity. However, given what we're seeing in the courts right now, in Congress right now, frankly, if the court had not stepped in, there was a major movement to try to pass that language in the first place. There was already a bill that had passed the House trying to amend the Civil Rights Act to include that language already. So in theory, yes, Congress could go back and undo this anytime there's an error in interpreting a statute, but whether they're actually interested in doing so is a major question.
Absolutely true. Carrie, first of all, it's so fun to talk to you because you're so well informed. And one other quick question. So I know you were very focused, your organization and you personally working, the Judicial Crisis Network and all that. You follow the Supreme Court confirmation processes of pretty much every recent Supreme Court justice. I assume you follow very closely the confirmation process of Justice Gorsuch. Does what he did in this case strike you as inconsistent with how he presented himself? Or is this just I think what you're saying a moment ago, is this just perhaps a misstep, but he really is the guy we thought he was? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, look, I was very supportive of Gorsuch during his confirmation process. I still support him. I'm not gonna paper it over when he gets one wrong. But I think in one sense, this is somewhat consistent with how he not just presented himself, but really his entire record. He had a decade on the court, on the 10th Circuit before this. But in some ways, I do think it's a departure. He certainly claims to be doing textualism here, so to that extent, it's consistent. But I just have a piece that I'm putting up shortly, and it has a quote from him, an earlier piece talking about how important it is to look at how the words are used originally by the judges or by the people who pass the law. You can't just take these words out of context, but you have to look at them as the legislators would have used those words. So he seems to have diverged from his, at least in that aspect, from his long and at the time very clear record in favor of textualism. I hope this is a one-off. I think what we've seen so far is that he's agreed more than any other justice on the court right now. He agrees with Justice Thomas, and I think that's a very good sign. I clerked for Justice Thomas, so I'm a real fan of his. And I hope that is something that it will continue, and that he won't be susceptible to these kind of false understandings of textualism in the future.
Carrie Severino, you say you're writing an article that will address this topic and this ruling and Justice Gorsuch. Where will that article be available?
It should be on National Review Online's Bench Memos is where I normally will blog.
Okay, so we will watch for it. Carrie Severino, first of all, thank you for your analysis. Very, very insightful, and you explained a lot in a short amount of time. So, and thank you for taking time to join us today. And everyone listening, please look out for Carrie Severino's article on National Review Online. And she has a lot of great coverage of all issues relating to the Supreme Court. So, Carrie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, folks, I got to tell you, by the way, there are numerous great articles out on this topic of the Supreme Court decision that it really kind of surprised everyone. You know, it was, I think maybe people always recognize Justice John Roberts as endlessly unpredictable. He's kind of becoming the McCain of the Supreme Court, you know, the kind of maverick, can't really figure out what he's thinking. Speaking of Justice Roberts, but I think people thought it would be 5-4 either way, depending whether Justice Roberts was flaking out or not that day. But it came out down 6-3. And there is a lot of commentary, and it's important to follow it to recognize the term I think Carrie used was the Pandora's box being opened. All the other issues that will now come to the fore in litigation or just claims in society generally, given the Supreme Court has now decided that gender identity, gender presentation, transgender status, all of the sexual orientation labels or claims, all of those are now, as the Supreme Court just ruled, protected under Title VII. So this did not settle a lot of things. It actually opened Pandora's box and many more things to come. But there are great articles on this already on my website, americacanwetalk.org. On the homepage, under shows, drop down, list of links. I encourage you to read a lot of them. They give you more context, more detail, more understanding. It's just a really, it's a country-changing decision. It's a decision many conservatives say this is how the left gets their way on many, many issues, from abortion to same-sex marriage, all sorts of other issues. We have the activist judges, that those who engage in legislating from the bench, judicial activism on the left, have really pushed law in this country more to the leftist preferences, more to the side of the left, and they get things through that would never pass the legislature. Even right now, what Carrie Severino was making reference to, that Congress has a bill already had a bill in place under Title VII to expand the word sex to mean sexual orientation and transgender presentation and all the other categories. I'm not sure that law was going to make it through the Senate. I don't even know if it passed the House yet. But the process in America, what I always want to defend is America. The process under America is your elected officials make policy. When the Supreme Court makes policy, you really, really are uprooting, upsetting the entire constitutional structure of this country. Not a good day. Final topic for today. You know, I want to talk about the military. Recent kind of, I use the word betrays the President of the United States, President Trump. And, you know, we didn't talk about this in this show very much. We made brief allusion to this, but you recall right after the protests in Washington, and including in this, and I don't even want to say protests, the rioters, looters, arsonists, thugs who've been ripping apart American cities for the last 10 days. In Washington, D.C., one thing they did was attack a church, St. John's Episcopal, very near the White House. It's a historic church. It's lovely. President Trump decided to make a statement by going across the street from the White House over to that church and standing in front of the church, as you can see in the background, damaged by the rioters and looters, and just to stand there with an array of other leaders of our country to say, essentially, we, the government, the president, we stand with this church. We stand with the people of America. We stand for the protection of private property. We stand for the protection of churches. And therefore, he's saying, you know, this is not okay in America to have rioters destroying a church. Not okay. So he did it was not a long service or ceremony. It was just a standing there. And it was a symbolic gesture I found to be actually very, very profound, very moving, very appropriate. Of course, leftists quickly said, oh, it's a photo opportunity, a photo op, just to, you know, who's he to get out? Like, he's not allowed to leave the White House unless the left says it's okay. So they mocked him for doing that. And they also, the left, engaged in a relentless misrepresentation or just straight out lies about how the president's safety was secured from walking from the White House over to the church. Because in order to make a safe passage for the president, other leaders of our country, from the White House to the church, there were rioters throwing things. You had statements from the Park Police saying there were rioters throwing projectiles, which usually means glass bottles, things that can hurt someone or even kill someone. And so the people whose job it is to protect the president were pushing the people back. There was first claims that they were you know, attacked in some way, that rubber bullets were fired, that there was and claims by these rioters that they somehow had the right to continue to throw projectiles toward the president and his entourage, continue to attack, and anyone who dared stop them was interfering with their First Amendment rights. A lot of confusion in America today, by the way, on the left about what your First Amendment right is. You definitely have the right to peaceably assemble. You have the right to protest. You don't have the right to take over, as they have done in Seattle, take over an area of land, and you don't have the right in this country. Your First Amendment right to protest does not include the right to throw objects at other people, to engage in violence. It does not include the right to burn down buildings, burn cars, smash windows, steal things. None of that's protected by the First Amendment. And President Trump was out there saying, in the middle of what's almost a war-torn looking Washington, we're not going to allow this. That was the symbolism, him standing there with the Bible in front of this church. So when I say the military is betraying President Trump, I'll start with the Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Mark Milley. I don't have his picture, but General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said on Thursday of last week he regretted participating in the photo opportunity. Now, this is a leftist site calling it a photo opportunity, but he regretted participating in that picture with President Trump at the historic church near the White House that was damaged during protests. He said, I should not have been there. He said it in a pre-recorded message to the graduates of the National Defense University. My presence in that moment and in that environment created a perception of the military involvement in domestic politics. So he's trying to give a kind of a, you know, the only reason I'm apologizing is because this is about politics and that's not our job. The military stays neutral in politics. That will be true if what we're watching was simply a domestic uprising. We are watching an attack on America. We are watching Marxist-funded organizations, radical left organizations, Soros-funded anti-American organizations placing our country under attack. So his kind of nuancing, parsing why it really wasn't okay is ridiculous. Second, even if that's actually his legal conclusion or his, you know, what his heart tells him, his logical conclusion, his job as the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is to privately say to President Trump, you know what? I don't feel great about having done that. It probably wasn't my job. So next time I probably shouldn't participate in that kind of photo op. That's what you do when you understand that, number one, America is under threat, and number two, we actually have a chain of command, and President Trump is the commander-in-chief. You do not go out and publicly humiliate the president, especially when you recognize the astonishing attack our country is under from the radical left. This is not Democrats versus Republicans. This is, you have America and you have people trying to destroy America, destroy our cities, destroy property with impunity, take over areas of our country, throw objects at the President of the United States, and you think this is a political dispute and I better stay out of it. But even if that's what he thought, his only recourse, if he were to be behaving like a respectable member of the military, understand his duty to support the commander-in-chief would have been a private conversation. So he also, additionally, we had challenges. So that was Mark Milley. General Mark Milley said that he's a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There were also, President Trump had this past week made comments about the fact that he is not going to rename Army installations that are currently named after Confederate leaders. This is another push consistent with the left of tearing down statues, tearing down monuments, desecrating monuments, even, as you saw at the start of the show, to somebody who was standing up against slavery. Get that, the Black Lives Matter people are desecrating a statue of a guy who was standing up against slavery 30 years before the Civil War. There's no logic there at all. What these people are doing is talking about the destruction of America. So President Trump, unwilling to give them an inch, and he's right, in my opinion, to say that, said, we're not renaming any of our military installations after, even though they are named after Confederate officers. So we had former Defense Secretary James Mattis criticized President Trump, openly criticized him, denounced the abuse of executive authority. This is, again, back to Lafayette Square. This is the president walking from the White House to the church. General Mattis weighs in. Former Defense Secretary Mattis weighs in, saying he denounces the abuse of executive authority of forcing protesters out of Lafayette Square. Like, the president isn't allowed to go where he wants, the protesters get to go where they want, and the president's supposed to sit around and act helpless. So again, Mattis, clearly shown himself to be, he's lost his gravitas that he ever had. I guess he really was a great military guy. Can't take away his military history, but he's become part of the radical left's attack on Trump. He's become part of the people who love the headlines, love the attention of being quoted, in some way denigrating the President of the United States. So here's what Mattis wrote, and we must reject any thinking of our cities as a battle space that our uniformed military is called on to dominate. We should use, and he goes on, militarizing our response should only be done by state governors. He sets up a false conflict between the military and civilian society. The military is on the side of the United States. When you have peaceful protesters in Washington who are holding signs, whatever those signs say, that's peaceful protest. When you have destruction of property, taking over of geographic areas of the country, violence, destruction of property, at some point, it is perfectly appropriate. This is Mattis attacking Trump for saying that we may have to call in the military under the Insurrection Act if the state governments cannot get their act together and contain and control the protests in their country. Mark Esper, Secretary of Defense, also weighed in, taking a public attack against President Trump. It's one thing, as I say, it's one thing, these people, because they've taken positions of authority, does not mean they've lost the right to think. It doesn't mean they've lost the right to have an opinion that is inconsistent with the president's opinion. They, however, are part of our chain of command. They are part of our structure. And for them to weigh in the public eye to attack the president, this is, I guess I can't say it's treason. I'm not going to go that far, but there are people who are saying you don't get to serve in these positions with authority in this administration and enjoy the public limelight of attacking the president, which seems to be what Esper has done. So we have, and I want to point out something important about this. This is in one of the articles linked on our website, americacanwetalk.org. This point is made in there. Under the previous presidency, under Obama for 8 years, many people documented, you had in the Obama era the cleansing of leadership level in our military, the removal of people who had a strong pro-America stance and the right of defending America and protecting America. A strong America was completely inconsistent with what President Obama was all about for 8 years. He was about weakening America. The military suffered under the Obama era, not just because he kept cutting funding and not providing sufficient supplies, weaponry, ammunition, everything else the military needs, because the very culture of the military, denigrated by President Obama, the removal of people who were in the high positions in the military, who were inconsistent with Obama's let's weaken the military plan, And so you have people now in leadership who's in the military who somehow survived 8 years of Obama's removal of strong pro-America people from the military. Think about that. Think about that. People who criticized Obama concerning the time he was negotiating with Iran to give them nuclear weapons. The whole Iranian deal was not to protect the world from the possibility of the Iranians developing nuclear weapons. It was to enable the Iranians to develop nuclear weapons. The entire purpose of the deal, military leaders pointing this out, military leaders question, and they had to leave the military. This is where we are in this country. We have a military, sadly, too many people at the highest levels survived there because they aren't the strong pro-military people we needed. So one article I urge you to read at our website, Mark Milley and Mark Esper, The Rising Costs of Barack Obama. You got to read this up, understand. So you now have the people who love the attention of the Beltway Approval Club of military. You got Colin Powell, David Petraeus, John Kelly, H.R. McMaster, James Mattis. They are all showing America how dang cool they are by criticizing the president openly, mocking his efforts to protect America. There's a brilliant piece on our website also called The Military Intelligence Complex by the just extraordinary writer Victor Davis Hanson. Another piece full of examples and explanation for how we have diminished our military and our intelligence, the connection between it, because we have people soft and understanding the idea of America. But I want to do one last thing before I go to telling you why the stories we talked about today matter to you. If you think all of this is just rah-rahing for President Trump and criticizing anybody who says anything about him, I think Trump deserves criticism on some points. I don't agree with everything he says and does. But when you're in the military and even you're ex-military and your job was to defend this country and you swore allegiance to the Constitution, which has only one commander-in-chief, and you've got your commander-in-chief and you don't like what he does, your job is shut up. That's your job. You don't have to vote for him next time. You don't have to get out there and praise him. But to be critical of this commander-in-chief at the time we're practically at civil war in our country is unconscionable. Now I want to show you, if you think it doesn't matter what these goofballs are saying, I have Matt the Wonderful, I sent him a clip of Joe Biden, how he is reading what Trump has been, what the criticism of Trump. Let me start before we play that clip to say, Joe Biden, was allowed out of the basement briefly this week. I mean, he never leaves the basement. They're trying to keep him, out of the public eye because he can't speak English well, because he is sadly suffering from some form of dementia and cannot put two sentences together. But they let him out, and then he did some interviews. One interview he did, he talked about the idea. He is trying to instill fear in the hearts of American people, saying, I'm afraid, I don't know, I'm afraid that, in the fall when Trump loses, or if he loses, he'll refuse to accept the results of the election. He may refuse to leave the White House. We may have to have the military go in to drag him out of the White House. That's what may happen. This is the idiocy spewing from Biden. But let me ask Matt the Wonderful at the end of the show today to play this little clip.
It's my greatest concern, my single greatest concern. This president's going to try to steal this election. And I was so damn proud. Here you have 4 chiefs of staff coming out and ripping the skin off of Trump. And you have so many rank and file military personnel saying, whoa, we're not a military state. This is not who we are. I promise you, I'm absolutely convinced they will escort him from the White House with great dispatch.
Okay, people. We're probably going to have to do a show sometime soon to talk about all of the various facets of insanity spewing from Biden's mouth in just that little clip. President Trump has never said, and he is not going to refuse to leave the White House if he loses the election November 2020. I think Trump is going to win by a landslide. I think the American people can finally see how completely crazed America's Democrat Party is, and they're watching waiting for some Democrat to be the grown-up in the room and take charge of our cities again, and they can't see anyone stepping up. But if it were to happen that President Trump lost the election in November 2020, he is not going to stay in the White House. He is not going to have to be dragged out by the military. And not only do I know that, I think you know that. I think Biden knows that. But Biden is thinking, he's convincing people, he's trying to scare people about who President Trump is. And when you heard that language, the way he's characterizing the people attacking President Trump, He uses the language that these people are tearing the skin off the president. You see what Biden is trying to say is that you see how deeply harmful and just a vicious attack it is on the president for these people of former political consequence, former military consequence, weighing in, attacking him publicly. It is playing to Biden's favor. These people, whether they're still serving or they're done serving, they can vote for anyone they want, but they are grotesquely interfering with President Trump's role as commander-in-chief. They're grotesquely interfering with his governance of this country at the time we're literally under attack from a Marxist element in this country. And when you hear how Biden characterized it, you understand it's powerful when they do that. Biden and other people who still think Biden has any clarity left to him, those people listening to Biden go, oh my gosh, that's right. Those people said those things. And so maybe it's really true. And maybe President Trump is just going to refuse to leave the White House. I mean, it's pure absurdity. But this is, I think, so this is what Biden is doing with it. This shows the harm and the true, just malicious nature of the comments by all those people in the military who had roles in the administration or roles in the military going after attacking President Trump. I know there are some people floating the idea whether those people could actually be at least investigated, but possibly court-martialed. I don't think so. I don't know. I think that'd be pretty extreme. But I think that people in the military in our country used to understand if you're serving an administration and you're in office of the administration, you do not run out and mock, ridicule, and denigrate a president, especially at the president you work for, especially at the time when we're under such a direct attack from Marxist forces in this country. We'll close out the show as I do every day by telling you why the stories we talked about today matter to you. So we started our show today about millennials, less patriotic, more socialist. I didn't even share the socialist numbers, but yeah, they're up there. So millennial rioters proudly destroyed the statue of an early abolitionist. This is not about standing up against racism. This is utterly ignorant cancel culture run amok. But restrain anger because the millennials are not making an informed choice to be less patriotic. They were never taught the why of patriotism. They were taught only the real or supposed or exaggerated flaws of America and her history and her ideals, only taught the bad parts. American patriots everywhere must reteach America to friends, neighbors, and family. America is unique. America is exceptional. It is the last best hope on earth still. No one will want to live in a leftist replacement for America. And on the Supreme Court legislating, I heard from Carrie Severino about this. The Supreme Court's 6-3 decision overlaying transgender rights onto legislation that never contemplated such rights is pure legislation from the bench. Gorsuch caved completely, appears to want applause from the LGBT community. Americans are increasingly fed up with 9 people in robes making up laws. The people's representatives in the legislature are supposed to pass laws. Supreme Court at very high risk of loss of authority in U.S. society. Americans see through the legal sophistry far more than elites understand. Supreme Court is nearing the line of being distrusted and potentially ignored by the people. Americans sense that President Trump is the only one fighting for the preservation of America as founded. And finally, when the military betrays the president. Milley apologizes for participating in the president's walk to St. John's Episcopal. Esper voices apparently unconditional opposition to presidential use of the anti-insurrection law. Mattis writes an anti-Trump op-ed. Petraeus, Kelly, and McMaster are apparently ready to join in criticism of the president. These are variations of insubordination and undermining of the commander-in-chief. Very dangerous. Maybe should be investigated for court-martial. This is what's left of an Obama-gutted military. Generals are more left-leaning than America defending. President Trump needs new military leaders who grasp and oppose the Marxism now attacking our country. And my very fine friends, that is America Can We Talk for today. Thank you so much for tuning in every Monday through Thursday, 3 p.m. Central Time, to America Can We Talk, where I always talk truth about America because America matters. And I'll talk to you next time.
America Can We Talk? Truth about America.